Hello, Future Tribe. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Thanks for joining us today. And you're joined by Germaine, of course, and Allie Delury. Hello, Allie. How are you today?
So good. How are you?
Good, thank you. Tell us a bit about yourself before we get started.
Absolutely. I just turned 30 a month ago, and I know most people when they're 30 years old, they kind of have their life figured out. They know where they're going to live and settle down, etc. But my fiance and I decided to quit our jobs in the States, head over to Australia, buy a big orange van, and travel around for a year. So we're doing that. It's a very recent endeavor, but prior to that, I was a television reporter. I was a combat photographer in the Air Force, among a million of other things. But basically, I've been working in the media sector for the better part of a decade, whether as someone in front of the camera or someone behind the camera. And that's currently what I'm doing today.
Yeah, so while you're driving around Australia in the van, you're still doing work, aren't you?
Yes, absolutely. So I mostly do freelance content creation work for travel clients in the US. So my primary client is a company called Tastemade Travel. They have headquarters in LA and New York City, but they basically create travel content and they employ freelancers who travel for a living to create that content for them. So I'm kind of mostly creating Australian content for them. But it's been great. We've done shoots highlighting Melbourne, Adelaide, Port Lincoln, Coffin Bay, Coober Pedy, among
Wow.
many other cities. So it's been
Wow.
so cool. And it's very cool as an American to showcase that kind of Australian culture to Americans who take in that content in the States. And
Yeah,
it's just,
yeah.
like I said, it's been so cool. And it's wild. It's we've done some work for clients within Australia, like Tiny Away. It's a tiny home company
Oh,
that
yep.
I think technically they're based in Singapore, but they have homes in Sydney and Melbourne that are gorgeous. So highlighting the tiny house movement here, and then we actually. I recently did a stint for a team Rubicon in response to the Australian bushfires. I was with them for a week as their primary photographer. So I was documenting some of the stories and the people who have lost everything. And I created photo and video content to remind the rest of the world that they still need help and they still need volunteers to help with that effort. Um, Disaster relief is something that I have covered on more than one occasion, unfortunately. And you
Uh-huh.
see the same thing within the media. It's really, there's exponential decline in coverage once the disaster is over.
Is
So
it
once the
over? Yeah.
hurricanes pass, once the fires pass, it seems like the coverage kind of moves on and people naturally kind of forget that these people have
Well,
still
they're still
lost everything.
rebuilding. Yeah, and they're still,
Yeah,
12 months down the line, there's still some of those people are almost still back at where they were 12 months prior, despite the lack of media coverage and despite the lack of attention. But going into,
absolutely.
so you found yourself in this sort of freelance content creation sort of position,
Yeah.
but that didn't come from, a lack of experience. In fact, I would say you've had a decade or so of experience in the sector. So you were doing, have you always, so you did reporting, photography as well? Is that something that you've always done, or is that something that you've sort of picked up recently? Give me an idea of what your expertise was before you've, put yourself into this position.
Definitely. So when I was 20 years old, I was hired as a sideline reporter for a Big Ten Network affiliate, which is like a sports network within the United States. And I was very young, and that was really my first exposure to being in front of the camera. So I thought for the longest time, like, this is where I meant to be. I'm meant to be reporting on a variety of stories, whether it's sports, whether it's investigative journalism, whatever. So I started in sports journalism at a very young age, and then after that, I transferred to just general news reporting. So I worked as a television reporter for an ABC affiliate uh,
Hmm.
within one of the states, Minnesota, small, very close to Canada. Not sure if you know, but it was like the topmost city, so it was very cold and very uncomfortable. But I was one of their reporters up there for a little while. And I just, it's not that I didn't like it. I very much enjoyed it, but I'm also very creative. And I found that I would watch my reports and say, I would maybe have filmed that a little bit differently. I maybe would have focused on a different angle. As a reporter, you're still kind of building the story and you're still interviewing people and sharing that story with a huge population. But there is a creative element that you miss out on because I always had a photographer with me who was kind of piecing the story together, overlaid with whatever script I produced. So I got very interested in kind of the behind the scenes work, video editing, photography, and very shortly after I was in the United States Air Force, specifically.
Sorry, I'm losing your audio. So going back to where were we? I guess going to your transition into photography and videography.
Yeah. So after I was doing news reporting, I served in the Air Force as a public affairs officer. So that's essentially someone that is an expert in public relations, crisis communication, strategic communication. So it's kind of the other side of the same coin when in terms of media and communication overall. So instead of being the reporter, I was now the person who was coordinating for reporters to, report on a certain angle within the Air Force story that I wanted to share. So
Mm-hmm.
it was a very different type of media, but it was still very interesting to me and I learned a lot. But I still didn't feel totally fulfilled. So I applied for a job within the Air Force called Combat Camera. It's exactly the way that it sounds. I was essentially in charge of training combat videographers and combat photographers to document war.
Wow.
So that was super fulfilling to me. That was an aspect of storytelling that I was very passionate about, but still coupled with the aspect of content creation that I was really looking for since I started my journey in media. So I got to train these people how to go to these austere locations and document stories just around the world. And so I did a lot of time in Africa, in Europe. And so that fulfilled like my travel itch. That's when I
Mm-hmm.
realized that I was passionate about travel. But that's when I really knew that, hey, I think I belong behind the camera. Like I'm training these people to do this thing that I am jealous of, that I want to
Want to
do.
do, yeah.
Exactly. So I got out of the military full time in 2017, I believe. And from there, I was like, all right, I'm gonna take a walk on the wild side a little bit. I'm going to get my feet wet in freelance content creation. And that's really when you saw kind of the rise of creatives. Because when I went to
Mm-hmm.
college, being a creative wasn't a career field.
Well,
It was you're
10
either
years ago, being sort of a content creator wasn't sort of a thing that you did. It was more, it's sort of like how gaming's taken that whole new angle now with streaming as well. It was more considered something that you do to keep yourself busy, something that it's almost an excuse to not have a job. Or it used to be, but now you see, people competing with CEOs and CFOs for, in terms of salaries, from just creating content, or whole companies built from that. So you jumped into freelancing in 2017, and how was that experience? What was that like?
Oh, it was so hard. Like if people talk about the grind, and I was so lucky for most of my life. I was employed with the company, I had steady income, benefits. When you start as a freelancer, especially starting kind of late as a freelancer, man, it's a struggle, like you're doing it gig by gig. You're still trying to figure out what your worth is. So I had all this experience, but it wasn't necessarily in content creation. It was in literally everything else
Mm-hmm.
that lets content creators, that employs content creators, etc. So I didn't know my worth. Like the first year, I was like, "Oh, you want me to create a 5-minute video that takes 4 hours? Yeah, I'll do that for $10." Like I had
Yeah,
no idea.
yeah,
I had no
yeah.
idea. Um, so I had to figure that out and figure it kind of out the hard way. Yeah, a lot of companies nowadays they work so often with content creators that they kind of understand the system and they understand that people don't necessarily value money anymore. They value access. They value things for free. So for a while, I had a ton of jobs with clients, but I wasn't getting money from them. I was just getting
Mm-hmm.
like free wine or free accommodation or free
Yeah,
etc.
yeah, yeah. Sort of in-kind payments.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought it was cool for a second. I was like, man, I get to do all this cool stuff. I get to travel. But then my mortgage bill would come in and I'm like, okay, well, free wine's not going to pay for that. Like,
Yes. How do I
how do I
make this sort of a
prove that?
thing? Yeah. So how long
Exactly.
do you think it took you to and are you in a position now where your freelancing is enough to sort of fund your life, would you say?
I would say that it's close. So a lot of the clients that I work with now, I now that I understand my worth and what my content is worth, I'm able to give an accurate quote for, okay, this is what I think you can pay for this. Um, but really, it's all based on relationships. So when I was first starting out as a freelance photographer, content creator, whatever, 2017, I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know people who did it full time. Like I was struggling. I wasn't making money. And then I picked up a gig with a company called Semester at Sea. And they were looking for a social media coordinator and a photographer to sail around the world for 4 months. So that is
Wow.
like the dream job, right? I was like, I made it. This is great. But they paid like barely
Nothing.
anything
Yeah.
because then they were like, we're basically paying for you to sail around the world. Isn't that enough? And so I'm doing this gig. I'm like, oh, I'm still traveling, but I'm still not making money. Like, how do I bridge this gap? And one of the women who worked with me, who was on my team on that ship, she ended up getting a job for Taste Made Travel. And that's how I got that in. It was the relationship that I built on this just whatever organization sail around the world trip. I met the one person who got me an in with one client. And
Hmm.
then I would meet someone else who would get me an in with another client. And like I just did a gig for Team Rubicon, total volunteer, wasn't getting paid for it, for their Australian bushfire relief. And I just got a call yesterday where they're like, hey, if you do one more month of volunteer, we can offer you a paid position after. So it's
Hmm.
like all of these relationships that you don't think about, but really that it's not what you know, it's who you know, truly.
Yes. Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's
I
how
mean,
that firsthand.
relationships are sort of, I look back through my trajectory as well, and it's often this one thing, this one friend whose parent had a boss who needed this, who then sort of trickled down and said, hey, Germaine, tap on the shoulder, do you want to help this very removed individual out? And then that leads to something else. And I think we're talking about two important things here. One is not just sort of understanding your value, but also not overstating your value, and understanding that your value transaction, just because you can take photos, for example, doesn't make you, just as valuable as anyone else who can take a photo for a client. And by that, I mean, being in a creative field as well, on my end, something I hear about often is, know your worth, just charge a client for what you're worth. But you get these people just getting into graphic design or just getting into marketing, and they're charging just as much as someone who has 5-10 years experience under their belt, when in
Mm-hmm.
reality they're thinking that they're charging what they're worth, but they're not. They're charging what someone else is worth. In fact,
Yeah.
I would argue that these people should be working for free, whether it's volunteering um, or just subsidized costs.
Mm-hmm.
But they end up not wanting to do sort of the hard work to, I think, build out, I guess, that cachet behind themselves to say, yes, I'm worth this much. Just like you went through that journey of understanding that, okay, 4 hours for $10, not only is that next to no money, but the 4 hours is actually more like 8, because they'll have revisions, they'll have changes, and I'm not going to be able to charge extra for it. So I'm essentially doing myself a disservice. But those things need to happen through that journey. But the next point is the fact of networking, and how powerful networking is and can be, because Correct me if I'm wrong, but you're now sort of working throughout Australia for these companies in the US, creating content for them, and essentially using the relationships that you've built out over the last 10 years to make your current life and current lifestyle a reality. Is that correct?
I mean, absolutely. And kind of going back to what you were saying about people who just enter the industry, charging the same as people who've been in it for a while and kind of judging their work based on others people's work. Another thing that I really struggled with, and that I do still struggle with, is you get people that undercut you, right? So if you tell a client, I'm worth 200, you'll get someone in there that says, well, I can do the same for half the price. And
Yes.
then the client goes to them and you lose that client. So it's like a lot of chucking and jiving with the industry a little bit, because you're like, okay, I really want this client. I want to build this relationship. Like how much do I undersell myself so that I get the client so that I can build that relationship later? And what is that worth to me? And that's something that, I mean, you probably experienced.
It's
And
still something that something that we go through the business, and we've found ways, providing very specific discounts, for example, or providing rather than discounting, what I like to do is offer more work on top that is not charged for, which sounds like a discount, but rather than cutting our price, we're just offering work, we're offering bonus work. But you make a good point about sort of people coming in and undercutting you. Do you still experience that? Or I guess, do you still come across that, and have you found a way to work with it or against it, or, combat that sort of thing? What do you do?
yeah, so usually, I mean, not usually, it doesn't happen that often, but sometimes I will get clients where I say, okay, I can produce this for you. This is how much it's going to cost. This is the amount of time that I'm going to dedicate for you and this project. And you'll get people that try to call your bluff a little bit, and they'll say, well, I have a friend who I know can do it for this much. And so
Hmm.
that at that point, it's just a conversation. And for me, for them to kind of whip out those cards early on in the conversation, it shows that maybe I don't actually want a relationship with this client. You know what I mean? Like if they're already doing that kind of stuff, then maybe I don't need them as much as I thought that I did. And maybe this is something that I can pass on and still maintain, my standard of like,
Yeah, and one thing that I've found freeing, and it's very hard to do. In theory, it's very easy, but in reality, it's very difficult. Is it's sort of changing that perception of your verse, instead of them paying you, you providing them a service, and them sort of paying you for that service. It's sort of flipping that. You're doing them a service and you're doing them something, rather than the other way around, which puts you in this position of, not just, is this the kind of person I want to do this work for? And, essentially you're doing someone a favor, um, but for money. But the other thing is also, is this the kind of work that I want to do for, my portfolio? Is this the kind of work that, if I accept A and B is a better thing, and B was to come past my, I'm not able to do B because I've just accepted A. Is that a transaction that I'm happy with? Now, it's easier said than done, because in theory, or in that theory, you only do the work that you love to do, but that's assuming that you don't have bills and you don't sort of get squeezed financially and don't get desperate. Um, but I think personally, the challenge there is that you've got to continue to market yourself, continue to network, continue to build out almost like this waiting list of people, or at least this browsing list of people who are sort of window shopping, and then it just becomes a matter of, I guess, building out your marketing funnel. But that's sort of going down a different journey. For you, how have you sort of made it happen? Is it really just having these constant clients that you'll get work from, and then doing supplementary services and getting supplementary jobs around that? Is that sort of how you manage to make things work?
yeah, I mean, I've now learned what it is that I'm passionate about in terms of the kind of content that I'm the most happy creating. When I first started as a freelancer, I remember I got like a newborn job, like a newborn photographer job. And I was like, okay, like, let's just see how this goes. But I realized very quickly, I'm like, I hate this. I hate babies. I especially hate babies that were just born and do nothing
Yes.
but cry. And I'm the photographer and I'm in the hospital and I have a cranky mom and like all. I was like, okay, definitely don't want to do this. I did a wedding for a friend once and I was like, okay, definitely can't do weddings. You know, you have all sorts of personalities and family politics, and all of a sudden you're more than just a photographer. You're like the emergency. Oh, bride needs this, groom needs this. Hey, you just standing there, go get it. So I learned very quickly. I'm like, okay, this is the kind of stuff that I don't want to do. And I realized, I was like, okay, I want to focus my efforts on travel. So once I learned the kind of content that I loved creating, it was so much easier for me to actually invest time in the clients that I eventually wanted to work for. So
Hmm.
Taste Made Travel was obviously already so high on my list, and it worked out that I knew someone within the company who could vouch for my skills based on a prior engagement that we had. Um, but yeah, it's so much easier, I think, as a freelancer, once you really know what you want to do, to actually hone your skills within that kind of genre, I guess you can
Yeah,
say.
and
So
it's sort of that
because
idea of like finding a niche and then just becoming so perfect for that niche that someone sort of looks at you and goes, well, like okay, you know, this person's travel photographer, we're after travel content. You're suddenly only competing with travel photographers rather than all photographers, and then you sort of, you know, go down that niche and you basically build out becoming the perfect person for the client.
Exactly. And I remember when I had the interview with Semester at Sea, they told me one of the things that made me stand out from the rest of the applicants who were all interested in travel and all have been to a million countries. They said, you were a combat photographer, so we know we can throw you in the rainforest in Vietnam and your
It's going to be
gear, you'll
nothing.
know how to handle that, you'll know how
Yeah.
to do this. Which was so interesting because I remember coming off of the Air Force experience, I was like, how am I going to use this skill again? I don't want to be a war correspondent, you know, like, how is this going to help me in the future? And it was just little things like that where they're like, you know, not only are you a travel photographer, not only are you savvy in travel, passionate in travel, but there's this one skill that you have that not a lot of people have that we can utilize for our client and our whatever product.
And not just skill, but also experience. And I think people are very quick to discount their previous sort of experiences. They sort of don't realize, they can't look at it and say, this is a strength. This is something that I can, you know, either hone in on or just look at it and go, I've had so much experience in this area that no one else can really compete. I just, you know, I deserve this spot. And I think it just comes back to sort of not just looking at yourself, but also understanding that you've got to put in a lot of effort to discover these things. People aren't just going to point it out for you. Not always, at least. In some cases, they might, but sort of you're your own marketing person. And I guess as a content creator, especially freelancing, that's the scary part because you are a company basically. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but instead of having, you know, a CEO and having someone to clean up after everyone else and having someone to do the admin and the billing, you just end up having to do it all and do the marketing and all of that as well. But it becomes very easy when you build out the network and build out the relationship and make sure that, because these people then become essentially marketers for you. Once they get to know you, they talk to you and they're impressed by your work. I mean, all you got to do is keep finding more people like that.
Yeah, well, what I realized too is that I used to really stress myself out because I would be on like Seek or Indeed or LinkedIn, like, what are the jobs out there? What can I apply for? And I realized that 90% of the jobs that you're going to get as a freelancer don't actually exist yet. And they don't
Hmm.
actually, you can't find them because those are the jobs that are just going to be curated for you once you have that relationship. So the organization that I worked with for the bushfire relief, they were like, you know, this position doesn't really exist yet, but we're impressed with your work. We want to keep you on a contractual basis. We're going to create this maybe in a few months. If you're interested, we'll put your name in. Like
Hmm.
that's how it works now. Like so many companies are just doing that. They're hiring out people that they trust, that they want long-term relationships with, and they're just making these contracts for them, and that's how people are getting these long-term work. It's not, I mean, it is a gig business, but it's slowly turning into just a contract business, and just knowing the right people and having those experiences, that is going to go such a long way. And I think people really get daunted by the idea of like traditional, oh, it needs to be on LinkedIn for it to be a thing. That
Yes,
that
for it to
really
be
is
a
not the
job or
case.
whatever.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very interesting how that's all kind of evolving.
Oh, I mean, it's. I think it's always existed, but what's changing is that the actual workforce is sort of shifting their mindset. So I think it's always existed that you can ask to, get a job curated for you or tweaked for you, or you can go and pitch it to someone. But I think that was almost frowned upon. Even 10 years ago, I think people sort of said, no, you're not allowed to ask for that. People, companies are paying you for a service, just do that job and that's it. If they don't have a job, you don't have a right for anything else. Where now I think people are shifting to, no, I want to have a life and I'm going to build out a life that I like, and work is a part of that life. And it's not the other way around. Life doesn't happen around work. It's vice versa. And organizations have started to realize that, one, it's cheaper for them, to pay a contractor for a job rather than paying them indefinitely, whether they do work or don't do work. I mean, the fires, for example, if you were to be contracted for that, uh, it wouldn't make sense for a business to hire someone to photograph bushfires when bushfires happen once a year. Like,
Yeah.
where's the logic there? So we're sort of hitting this interesting time where, myself, I think I still have fairly traditional thoughts around work, and that's shifting. And that's part of my upbringing as well, and it leads to this level of anxiety about, because there's uncertainty around the kind of the shift that's happening, right? Freelance work, there's uncertainty. Having a business and having to get our own work, there's uncertainty, um, which leads to some level of anxiety because, well, if we don't turn up and we don't market and we don't convince people, well, we're going to go hungry, more or less. But it also leads to, you can set up coping mechanisms around it. And as I'm sure you and your fiance did before you moved, you thought about the financial side of things. You did the numbers and you sort of realized, you're not going to come over here and spend $200 a day on food, because that's not going to be sustainable, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and it's just so interesting because for the longest time, like I said, being a 30-something-year-old, I grew up with this initial intention of getting a job that I would stay with for the rest of my life. And that has been pounded into us for so long. And like our parents' generation, the generation before that, companies had the power. They had the power. And if you were a part of a company, you were going to be taken care of because you were going to have a pension and you were going to have
Hmm.
benefits and all this stuff. But the company still had the power. The company could still let you go and get rid of that pension no matter how long you've been with that company. And you hear that story time and time again. So it's just so interesting because now the shift is finally happening where the individual has the power, and the individual is like, this is my worth. This is what I'm willing to do. These are the hours I want to work. This is the exact type of work that I want to do. And you pitch that to a company, and a company says, yep, I want that. But the company doesn't have power anymore. You know what I mean? Like it,
Yeah, yeah.
maybe in some respect they
Well,
do
I
a
mean,
little bit.
everyone's still got a certain level of power, just like the employees did in the more traditional method. Because if they don't turn up, then work doesn't get done. So there's a certain
Mhm.
level of power, but there's still a shift in that paradigm, which is interesting. Um,
Yes.
Now, tell me, moving forward, what are your plans? So, do you have sort of so you're traveling through Australia? Is there sort of a end date when you sort of will head back home, or?
Yeah, so it's so funny that you talked about the financial implications of just picking up, leaving everything behind and trying out a new life in a new country, because we definitely had to have that conversation. And our goals have changed so much since November when we showed up here. Initially, we were going to be here a year. That was the
Mhm.
plan. We're like, okay, we're going to get after it. It's going to be great. We have money saved up. This is what we're going to do. But we found maybe like 2 months into our trip that we were constantly crunching numbers. We were constantly like, oh, okay, we spent $7 on an eggplant, so that's our food for the day. You know what I mean? Like, and we were foregoing tourist attractions. We were constantly like, okay, maybe we don't do that because we're trying to save money. We got to last a year, and we had to really reshift our focus. And we had to sit down and say, okay, why are we doing this? We're here because we love travel. We love to meet people. We want to do the work that we love.
And see
But
attractions, I assume, as well. See the
of
things that
course,
you're visiting. Yeah.
yeah. So, and we didn't want to forego that just to say that we were in Australia for a year, like just to check that box. And after a while, it felt like we were just checking boxes.
Mm-hmm.
So we said, you know what? Let's cut the trip in half. That way we can do more financially. We have more flexibility. We can do X, Y, and Z. But we'll get literal more bang for our buck doing it that way. So that's the goal right now. I think we're probably going to try to head out of here maybe May, June, July timeframe. But we're still flexible. We don't have a return ticket booked
Mm-hmm.
yet for the
Mm-hmm.
States. That's our plan. Maybe something will happen where we re-extend for a while. Who's to say? But we've had to have that conversation quite a bit, because you're right. I mean, that's, I think, what is most daunting about doing what we're doing is that there is a financial setback in some way, shape, or form. And you just have to understand, okay, this is the maximum that I'm willing to spend. And if I don't, this is how I'm going to reprioritize what my goals are for this trip. But so far it's been amazing. And like I said, my fiance, he's a comedian, so he's been performing at various venues here. And so either way, we're both progressing in our skills. We're
Mm-hmm.
both doing the things that we want to accomplish in order to get ourselves ready for the next level, whatever that looks like back in the States.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you have your own podcast as well, is that right?
Yes, yep. So it's called Work Our Way. It's a play on the term work away, which is something that we first figured out when we got to Australia was even a thing. But yeah, it's called Work Our Way. And basically we talk about what we experienced over the last week. It's weekly episodes released every Monday. And yeah, we talk about comedy, we talk about travel, and we just talk about all the funny things that have happened to us through the eyes of two somewhat ignorant Americans. So we really, nothing's off the table in terms of what we talk about. And yeah, no, it's been a good ride.
Awesome. We'll include the links to that in the description as well. Where can people find out more about you?
So feel free to check out our website, workourway.com. There's a link for Patrick and all of his comedy stuff. And then there's a link for me. Most of the videos that I've created for Australia and for the various clients we talked about are on there. But yeah, that's where we put everything. We have a YouTube channel that's on there. We have an Instagram. That's kind of the one-stop shop if you want to just check out more of what we're doing. But
Awesome.
yeah,
Fantastic. We'll link that as well. Are you ready for the top 12?
let's go for it.
Okay. So top 3 books or podcasts that you recommend.
So I will admit I am not a really big reader. I don't know if this is like common with creatives who specialize in video or photo, but I find myself just watching YouTube tutorials on how to edit a certain way versus reading a book. But yeah, I would say 3 podcasts. I mean, this is going to sound, I'm sure this is on everyone's list, but the Joe Rogan Experience is one that I started listening to on this trip. And, we have long drives across the Nullarbor, we've been to the Outback, we spent a decent amount of time in our van. So we get after the podcast game, and
Mm-hmm.
Joe Rogan Experience is just one that is great. Joe Rogan, comedian, he has all these amazing guests on his podcast, and they talk for hours and hours sometimes. And it's great. He's had a couple politicians on there from the States. He's had, scientists, historians, actors, just everybody. So that's a breath of fresh air in terms of just what I like most about storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's just something that I'm a huge, huge fan of. Tuesdays with Stories is another podcast. It's with Mark Norman and Joe List. I don't know if you listen to that, but another great comedy podcast. And it's kind of the same it's structured the same way as our podcast, where they just kind of recount everything that happened to them over the last week. But they're two very funny comedians, so it
Hmm.
is. I mean, it's just so funny.
Yeah, I
It's
love
just
Mark
you're
Norman.
laughing. Yeah.
I love his stuff. So
Oh, so
awesome.
good.
And a third podcast?
I am trying to think off the top of my head what another good one is. But I'll tell you a book that I just read.
Oh yeah.
So I don't. Um, All the Light We Cannot See. I forget who wrote it, but it's, I think, a Pulitzer Prize novel,
Hmm.
or it won some award. I don't know,
Hmm.
but it's a story that takes place during World War II, through the eyes of two young kids, and it's great. It's interesting. Um, yeah, those are my three.
Awesome. Top three software or tools that you can't live without.
Oh man, this is such a millennial thing to say, but Instagram, love Instagram.
I mean, that helps
On
for
it
your work as well, I would assume.
100%, yeah. And a lot of the clients that I have too, if I'm not creating content, then I'm managing their social media.
Hmm.
So it's something that's not going away. Huge fan of creating Instagram stories and showing clients how to utilize that aspect of Instagram. That's just something that I love. I'm trying to think. So this is kind of one that not a lot of people know about, but it's called Life Lapse. I don't know if you've heard
Okay.
of it.
No.
It's an it's an it's so dumb, but it's an app for stop motion video. So you create stop motion videos on it, and it is just so fun. um I remember stop motion when you had to set up like a giant camera on a tripod and like
Hmm.
set a timer, and it took like hours to edit. This you can all do from your phone, and it's nice because you can like take a picture, and then it kind of there's like a, God, what do you call it, like 50% of the picture is still there, but then
Right.
you
Yes.
can
Yeah.
still use it as a frame of reference to get your
Hmm.
next picture. Um,
Okay. That sounds
so it,
awesome. It sounds like you can, I'm always a fan of finding new ways of expressing already established mediums, and stop motion is this old school, everyone knows stop motion, but I feel
yeah,
like videos a bit boring. Boomerangs are getting a bit, I'm getting a bit over boomerangs as well.
yeah,
So
no,
yeah, that's an awesome tip. Is there a third?
yeah. So, and this is interesting because, like I said, I'm 30. I'm kind of an old content creator, just in comparison to some of the people that I've worked with. But TikTok very recently has grabbed my attention, and it's kind of like the old Vine. I don't know if you were ever into
Yeah,
Vine.
yeah.
I was super bummed when they went out of business and went away. So TikTok is kind of that fix, a temporary fix for that. But it's fun. It's a great place to watch just very short clips that you know video editing, comedy, like they have everything on there.
Everything.
And
Yeah.
people are using it for just really cool things. A lot of clients now are utilizing it, like
Oh,
Chipotle
TikTok's
and Target.
on the up and up, the way I see it. I've only just sort of I've known of TikTok for a long time, but I've only just sort of been starting to understand its earlier, and yeah, I can see why it's working. That's awesome. Top three mantras you try and live by, stuff that you tell yourself, when things aren't going so well, or stuff that you tell yourself every day. Anything come to
Hmm.
mind?
Yeah, so there was a quote that I found when MySpace came out because I needed like a stupid quote for my homepage, and I was just Googling quotes. And there was one that stood out that I just never forgot. It's, "My biggest fear is that I'll look back on my life and wonder what I did with it." And that has always kind of stuck with me in everything that I did. And it's really helped motivate me to take the risks that would deter a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Because I just figure, even if I fail, I would rather say that I did it and tried than not do it at all, which I know is kind of cliche, but that's just, I thought that was a really powerful one liner on kind of the way that I want to live my life. So that's one that I look at a lot. The other two mantras aren't really mantras, they're just stupid tattoos that I have. That I got in various countries around the world. So I got one recently in Finland. I was going through a really tough time there emotionally. I was just, I was dealing with distance from my fiance. I was in a job that I didn't like. And it was really right before we took the leap to come out to Australia. But I was in a taxi with this guy, and I was like, hey, do you guys have like a phrase that you use here in Finland that's like cool that I can like tattoo on my body? They said sisu. It's SISU, and you can look it up. It has a couple different meanings, but it's essentially it kind of just means like badass in short, but it specifically is it's like that second wave that you get like when you're being like hit your hardest and you're like about to give up. It's like that that that
Yeah.
sensation of like, I'm
Like
gonna
the
get back.
second, second win, like, something that just comes out of nowhere and helps you push through, sort of thing.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
exactly what it is. And there's
Yeah.
no like real English word for it. So that I think about that and I'm like, man, when things get really, really tough, all I need is just that just almost
Hmm.
final step, but that's what pushes you through to the other side. So that's cool. And then this is another tattoo I have. I got in Japan. It's the word ikigai. I don't know if you've heard of it or
No.
the concept, but it's like this little Venn diagram where you essentially there's this very small thing in the middle that is like true happiness and true sense of purpose and being, and it's doing what you love, doing what the world needs, doing something that makes money, and then something else, something you're passionate about maybe. But all of those things in the middle forms your ikigai, and people spend their whole lives trying to find it.
Find it.
They
Yeah.
spend their whole lives thinking that it's just doing the 3 out of the 4 things and sacrificing one of those things all the time. But if you can kind of have
Find the
that
perfect
perfect
balance.
storm. Exactly. And the way that they found out about ikigais, they went to like this Japanese village, and there were these people there that were living until like 90, 100 years old. This whole village, it was just full of old people. And they're like, how the hell are you guys living so long? And they were like, because we found our ikigai, like
Wow.
that is, yeah. So that's really cool. And there's actually a ton of books about it. If you're looking for something motivational, just go to any bookstore and look for a book that talks about ikigai. But they go so in depth about how to find it, what to do, all these things. So
That's
that's
amazing. Awesome. And the last one, top 3 people you follow or study.
so people that I follow that are very inspirational. There's one, and this is gonna sound creepy, but I promise it's not. I've been following her since she was 17, but her name's Demi Bagby. She has like 2 million followers on Instagram, but she's this girl that like broke her back when she was 14, got into CrossFit, and is now like arguably one of the strongest females that I've seen in like a
Wow.
competitive setting. She
I'm
like
going
can
to look her
do,
up right now.
yeah, she can do just crazy stuff, and she posts videos of her workouts, and they're just like beyond what I can ever comprehend doing in my lifetime. And she's doing
Yeah.
it at now a 19-year-old. But I've followed her journey for 2 years, so I'm a little more emotionally attached to her now. But she's great. Huge fan of her. There's another YouTube comedian, Laura Cleary. Um, she recently came out with a book called Idiot that I still have to read and find. I haven't found it since being in Australia, but
Hmm.
she was like your typical actress. She lived in LA for a while, but she started as like a coke and heroin addict. Like she was falling apart. Like she constantly posts pictures of her just like super skinny and super out of it and addicted to drugs and all this stuff. And she got sober, I want to say like 10 or so years ago, maybe not even that long. But since she got sober, she has become like super successful. She's comedian on YouTube. She has also a very large Instagram following, and it's just been great. She's got like a kid now. She's married, and you really kind of just see the whole full circle of her
Yeah, the
life.
full journey.
And it's yeah, and it's inspiring to see the fact that she came from like this crazy background where she really just kind of drove herself into the ground emotionally and spiritually and all these things, and was able to come out on the other side even more successful. So that's just a cool story. And she's funny, you know, she puts out like videos of some of her stuff, and it's great. But yeah, I guess the third person, I'm just kind of trying to rack my brain. I've always been a huge fan of Katie Couric. She was really my inspiration when I started as a journalist, and I haven't followed her as much recently, but I've always kind of looked up to her story, and you know, whether it's her personal life, you know, losing a husband to cancer, raising kids, and being a successful journalist in the midst of all of that, to really just kind of, you know, that's something that I always aspired to be as a journalist. And even though I'm no longer on that track, I still really admire her story, and I admire the way that she does storytelling, because that's a constant that I've always tried to really implement in my work, is the storytelling aspect.
Yeah.
And you know, if you go to the website and you look at my tab, you'll see that a lot of the people that I still talk to, I really still try to make that the focus. Even if there's like branding and other stuff that you need to incorporate, I make sure that no matter what, the storytelling is there. And she was really my first inspiration in understanding how to do that tactfully.
Awesome. That's a very solid answer for someone who only, you know, got the questions about an hour ago. So there are some really, really awesome people that I'm going to look up myself and start following myself as well. And it's always nice when I think it's nice to see um, sort of stories go through, like the people's stories on social media, and it's not just the, you know, look at my wins and look at how amazing my life is, but it's sort of these you know, look at me picking myself back up, or look at me when I failed, and this is what I've been able to do. I think social media is often sort of discredited because people think it's just a way of getting yourself down, but to me, it's a way of motivating myself and inspiring myself as well, or as much as it is to look at and say, oh, you know, this person has this or that person has that. There's some real positives to social media. So yeah, I'm actually glad that basically you highlighted that as well throughout. So thanks for hopping on the podcast. Of
Yeah,
course, we'll have all the links that we've discussed in the description. And yeah, I hope you have a good stay for the rest of the time that you're in Australia.
definitely. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us, Ali.
All right. See ya.